Hey, thanks for just joining. Just letting a few more people join before we get started. So if you are just joining, just hold tight. We're going to get started here in just a moment. So we'll just wait a few more seconds before getting started, just to let a few more people join. Hey everyone, so welcome to our next edition of Fundamental Fridays. Today I'm going to be talking about a brief introduction to Ganache balancing, so hope you're excited for that. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you checked out our Fundamental Friday last week, which was on the fundamental sugars that we use in Ganache. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it and let's get started with the presentation. So just a few things first. Make sure that you sign up for our newsletter, and that way you can get the PDF of the presentation that I'm about to present to you. We'll be mailing that out next Thursday, so just keep that in mind. So please sign up for the newsletter, and that way you can get a copy of this presentation. While you're there, also make sure if you sign up for a free account, you can also access our free courses. As you can see, just take a look for the free symbol on any of those courses. During the COVID-19 crisis, we've made a bunch of the courses available for free, so please make sure to take advantage of that. Lastly, if you have questions, we're going to do a Q&A session at the end. Okay, so if you have any questions, just put them in the question box below, and I'll make sure that we try and address as many of those as possible at the end of this session. Okay. Okay, so what is balancing and why balance a ganache recipe? This is the topic of today, so we'll delve right into it. So underneath every ganache recipe is a ratio of ingredients. So here you can see on the screen, we've got a classic ganache ratio, a recipe, and below it, actually the ratio of ingredients. Okay, so this is the very first step when we start to talk about balancing is you actually want to turn all of your recipes into ratios or percentages, okay? Because as we become more and more complex with our ganache recipes, they're harder and harder to visualize. So by putting them into percentages, it makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so that's the first step. And we see here, this is a fairly classic ganache recipe, nothing too crazy. We just have heavy cream, some glucose syrup, dark chocolate, and some fresh butter. Okay, so all of those ingredients in ganache, they directly interact with one another. And by focusing on those percentages, we'll easily distinguish the difference of those interactions when we make our tests in the kitchen. We'll be able to see, oh, this has more butter or this has more water, for example. Okay, and then by respecting some certain ratios, which we're going to talk about, that's going to end up saving us time and also saving us some money in the long run. So working on the range of ratios for all of those ingredients, well, that's exactly what balancing is. So for example, you might have a ganache that you find a little bit too sweet. So you may say to yourself, well, let's reduce some of the glucose syrup and reduce the sweetness a little bit. Okay, that's fine, we could do that. But you can see here in this recipe, on the top is the original and on the bottom is the recipe after reducing the glucose. And so you can see that the ratio of all of those ingredients changed, okay? By reducing the amount of glucose, that increases the percentage of all of the other ingredients. So whereas before we may have had a recipe with a very good texture but too much sweetness, now we have less sweetness, but maybe we threw off the texture because we made this change, okay? We can see this a little better if we look graphically. You can see here, this is the glucose syrup here, so you can see the reduction in the glucose syrup. And this reduction in glucose syrup caused the increase of all of the other ingredients, okay? So it fundamentally threw off the original balance of our recipe. So part of balancing is avoiding this problem, Okay, so when you change one ingredient, we then need to start changing all of the other ingredients to compensate for this first initial change. Likewise, if you wanted to increase the ratio of an ingredient, say chocolate, for example, because you want more chocolate flavor, the exact same thing will be happening. By changing the amount of chocolate, you're going to be changing all of the ratios throughout the recipe. So when we add more chocolate, we're adding more fat, obviously. So that means you may need to reduce the amount of cream, for example, in the recipe, or you might want to reduce the amount of butter in the recipe. Each decision that you make, it's up to you. So when you increase the fat from the chocolate, we need to reduce fat somewhere else, whether that's the cream or the butter or whatever other changes that you want to make, that's up to you. But understanding those changes to the taste, the texture, and the shelf life, that's where balancing can really help you out. So why would we balance? Okay, this balancing is going to ensure that we keep an ideal texture, an ideal sweetness. We'll have good stability over time. We'll be able to anticipate the correct water percentage for the desired shelf life. And this will also mean that our texture is not likely to change from either the original or it's not likely to change over time. And all of this allows us to see these potential problems before actually making the recipe and allows us also to evaluate results after we make the recipe. This allows you ultimately to work faster because when you get in the kitchen, you're going to have to make fewer tests of your recipe. You can make maybe only 1 or 2 tests instead of making 5 or 6. And obviously that saves you time and money. And lastly, by visualizing those changes, we can see how these ingredients start to interact with one another. Okay, some people may ask though, but do I need to balance my recipes? Okay, well, maybe. Okay, so ask yourself some questions. The first one being, do you like math? Okay, because there is some math involved. So if you like math, it's going to be a little bit easier. Other questions, as you can see, are you unhappy with a recipe? If you have a recipe, but you're just not sold on it, it's not exactly the right texture or the right flavor. Another reason might be because you make a lot of ganaches and you want to reduce complexity in your recipes. Okay. Or if you change recipes often, let's say that you're making your recipes and they're very seasonal. You change your fruit purees a lot depending on which season you're in. Obviously, every time we change one of those ingredients, our ganache recipe is going to change. So that's where balancing can help you very quickly make changes to your recipes. Okay. Other reasons, you want to maximize profits. You want all of your ganaches to be as consistent as possible. So imagine you have 12 ganaches in your display case and you want all 12 of them to have exactly the same texture. Well, balancing can help you achieve that. And that way one ganache is not very soft while the other one is very hard. It makes for a nice uniform texture throughout your products, which obviously benefits you and also benefits the consumer of your products because they anticipate the mouthfeel of a certain type of product that you're offering. And then lastly, if you just want your recipes to be unique, okay, you don't have to create ganache recipes. You can use thousands of ganache recipes that already exist. But if you really want ultimate control and you want to really define your own recipes, balancing can help you do that. And then obviously, if you're like me and you're just curious, maybe that's a good reason to balance your recipes as well. So before you say to yourself, well, I have to balance my recipes, it's not necessarily true. Just ask yourself a few questions before you get into it. And you'll see, I'm going to show you a few different examples. So balancing can be as simple or as complex as you like, okay? The more you know about the ingredients, the more profound your understanding of ganaches will become. So we're going to talk a little bit about ingredients in a moment. That's going to be very important. However, even with just limited knowledge, you can make some informed decisions that's going to be very helpful even for the vast majority of pastry chefs who don't balance their recipes. Okay, but before we start actually into the balancing, we are going to talk a little bit about ganache itself. Okay, so the basic types of ganache. We have pastry ganaches and we also have what I call confectionery ganaches. So obviously pastry ganaches are going to be higher in their total liquid content, and they're going to be used for glazes, for fillings inside of cakes or entremets. We might also pipe them on top of cakes, and many more applications in the pastry kitchen. And then obviously in the confectionery kitchen, we're going to pour ganaches into frames, and then later we'll cut those with the guitar, or we might pipe those into a polycarbonate mold. We might make a spreadable paste, and again, many more applications, okay? So the ratios that we use for every single one of these ganaches is different, okay? We don't have one single ganache that we can make for everything. So for example, the top we have a piped pastry ganache, okay? And you can see it's quite simple in its composition compared to the ganache that is underneath it, which is a framed ganache that we might make to be enrobed in chocolate, for example. Okay, so you can see the top recipe. The ratios are very simple. Okay, it's 2 parts of chocolate to 1 part of each other ingredient. Okay, and all we have is 4 ingredients: milk, heavy cream, some glucose syrup, and chocolate. Whereas for the framed ganache below, we have many more ingredients, and we have a more complex balance of those ingredients. Okay, and the reasons for this are quite complex, but for one, the pastry ganache doesn't need to last as long, and we don't need as many ingredients because of that. It's one simple explanation. Obviously, there are many more, and we'll look at those as we continue. Okay, so before people balanced recipes, and I'm talking, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, before we had readily available information about our ingredients, a lot of people were making their ganaches just based on ratios. Just like I described in the previous slide, you would have a pastry ganache that's just equal parts, or a 1-to-1 ratio of heavy cream and dark chocolate. This is the simplest ganache that we can make, okay? And then for a confectionery ganache, it was very, very easy to just double the amount of chocolate, and then we would have a 2-to-1 ratio. So 2 parts of chocolate to 1 part of cream. And working this way with simple ratios is very effective. It's very similar to how bakers work when we do baker's percentages for bread or other applications in the bakery. You can do the same thing with your ganaches. However, with the advent of modern technology and more access to information, we've moved away from basing our ganaches on ratios, and we're going to talk more about the percentages of each component inside of that ganache. So the main ingredients, like I said, you have to know a lot about your ingredients in order to fundamentally understand the changes that happen when you balance a recipe. So here on the screen, I just have the basic ingredients that we see over and over in our ganache recipes. Obviously, you've got dairy products such as heavy cream and milk are very classic ingredients, fruit puree, infusion, all of the liquids, and then below that, all of our solid ingredients. And this is the first step, is to really break your ingredients into their different components, their liquids versus their solids. Okay, so solids would be anything such as fats or cocoa solids that you have in sugar, or in chocolate, or your sugars. Other things might include spices or even the milk solids that are inside of the heavy cream. So heavy cream, for example, has both liquids and solids in it. So understanding the composition of these ingredients is going to become crucial. So you want to find out as much as possible about all of your ingredients. And this is one of the most common questions that I get asked is, well, how do I do that, Russ? And the answer is not always easy. The best place that you can find out about your ingredients, if you're in the professional kitchen, is obviously the manufacturer's spec sheets. So if you have access to those, that is definitely the place to go for ingredient information. However, not everyone always has readily available the spec sheets. So if you don't have the spec sheets, there are some other resources, such as the USDA Food Data Central Database, which I'll show you in just a moment. Obviously, good books and trusted publications. And if all else fails, Google searches. I can't tell you how many times I found the information that I need just through a simple Google search. So this information is out there. You just have to dig for it a little bit. And if you are a professional working in the professional kitchen, Definitely demand the spec sheets from your suppliers. Companies are required to give you those, so just make sure that you're asking for them, and your sales rep should be able to help you out with that. Okay, so for example, this is a spec sheet of Pâtisserie France glucose syrup, which is something that I think most all of us in the professional kitchen have seen on the shelf. And I did exactly that. The supplier here in Canada, I just asked them for the spec sheet, and they produced it for me. Okay, and so in this spec sheet, you can see it tells us some crucial information. Okay, so for example, it tells me here the dry extract is 79% dry extract. Okay, so that means the rest is water. So that way I can figure out how much water is in my glucose syrup. So here we should have about 20 or 21% of water in the recipe. And you can see it gives you a lot of other information as well that might not be applicable for balancing, but it might. And also, if you joined me last week, we were talking about the dextrose equivalent of your glucose syrups, and that's actually this right here. You can see equivalent of dextrose is 37.5. So I would round that up, and this syrup has a DE of 38. Okay, so that's where I find the dextrose equivalent information on the spec sheet. Okay, so that's just one example. So if you can find the spec sheet, whether it's for glucose syrup or chocolate or heavy cream or butter, if you have this spec sheet, that's going to be the most trustworthy source for ingredient information. Other things, like I said, publications. So if you joined me last week, we published just yesterday the PDF of last week's sugar presentation, in which you have a chart that compiles all of the sugars. And here it tells you the dry content of those sugars, so on and so forth. So if you have trusted sources, publications that you look at or have access to, you can also find good ingredient information there. This is the Food Data Central Database from the United States Department of Agriculture. And you can see here I just did a simple search for milk, and it returns the results. You can see how much energy, protein, fat, so on and so forth is in the milk that you might be using. So this is another very handy resource. It gives you a lot of information about a lot of commonly found ingredients mostly in the grocery store. So this database will not have information on glucose syrup or sorbitol or something like that. But for more common ingredients, such as, I don't know, bananas or peanuts, you're going to find the compositional data here. Okay. So those are definitely the best places to look for information. So let's talk a little bit now about how these ingredients actually affect our ganache recipe. So the main ways in which these components are going to affect ganaches are as follows. Okay, so cocoa butter inside of our chocolate, that's going to contribute to firmness of our ganaches and also to the mouthfeel. Okay, so we all know how chocolate melts in the mouth. So that's going to be one of the properties coming from cocoa butter. We're going to have the same thing from dairy fat. Conversely, with cocoa butter, you can see that dairy fat actually contributes to softness, okay? Because cocoa butter at room temperature, think about a chocolate bar, it's very hard, versus think about a block of butter at room temperature, it's much softer, okay? So dairy fat is contributing some softness to our ganache and also mouthfeel as well. Other liquid oils, such as extra virgin olive oil, if you were adding that to your recipe, or if you had nut paste or something in your recipe, those will be contributing to softness as well, because those remain liquid at room temperature. Sugar's the same. They're going to contribute to softness, and also they're going to start extending the shelf life of our ganaches, as well as dry substances. They're going to obviously affect the texture and the shelf life, and so will water do exactly the same thing. So if we look here, you can see as the cocoa butter percentage increases, so does the texture. The texture goes from very soft with a low cocoa butter percentage to a very firm texture with a high cocoa butter percentage. Dairy fat, the opposite. Okay, so as the dairy fat percentage increases, the texture of our ganache becomes softer and softer. And so this is a classic reason that butter is added into our ganaches, is because 9 times out of 10, if you're making a 2-to-1 ratio ganache, it's going to be very firm. So a way to make that a bit softer is to start adding dairy fat to it. So that's why dairy or butter is a very classic ingredient in ganaches. Oil's the same thing. So you see as the percentage of oil increases, the texture is going to become softer and softer. And then with sugar, as the sugar increases, the texture will become softer and the shelf life will become longer. The more sugar that we have in our recipe, as we learned last week, sugars are preservatives. So the more preservative that we add into our ganache, the longer we can anticipate the shelf life to be. However, if you add too much sugar, your ganache becomes too soft. So we're back to balancing. How do you make the ganache have the proper texture with also the correct amount of sugar inside? Dry matter. So as dry matter increases, shelf life also increases, but as dry matter increases, the texture gets harder and harder. Okay, if we end up at 100% dry matter, we're back to a solid chocolate candy bar. We're no longer have a ganache. So again, right back to balancing. How do we have a high percentage of dry matter so that we have a longer shelf life while still having a good balance of the other ingredients? Lastly, water content. Okay, so as water content increases in our recipe, the shelf life becomes shorter and shorter. Okay, and similarly, as it increases, the texture becomes softer and softer. So this is, you can start to see how the balance becomes important, is because we can't have too much water, but you can't have too much sugar, so on and so forth. Okay, so some balancing basics. How do we actually do this? So, as I talked about earlier, underneath every ganache recipe, there's a percentage, attached to those ingredients. But it's not the percentage of the ingredients that I actually care about. It's actually the percentages of their fundamental components. Okay, so if you can see here, a very simple example is olive oil. So olive oil only has one component, so it's only contributing fat to the recipe. So it's a very easy ingredient to work with. Whereas heavy cream is a much more complex ingredient. You can see that the heavy cream is actually composed of several things: fat, non-fat solids, and water, amongst others. So this is being very basic. Okay, so here we actually, whenever we use heavy cream, for every 100 grams of heavy cream that we add to our recipe, we're actually adding 57 grams of water and 37 grams of fat, for example. And so if you're working with chocolate, it's even more complex. You can see that chocolate's bringing several different functional components to the recipe. It's bringing cocoa butter, it's bringing cocoa solids, it's bringing milk fat in this case because it's a milk chocolate. It's bringing sugar, but it's not bringing any water. Okay, there's no water in chocolate. Okay, but I think you get the point. There's very complex ingredients that we work with. Fruit puree is another one. So fruit puree, it has water in it, it has solids in it, it has sugar in it, so on and so forth. So it's very important to understand the functional percentages of every ingredient that you use. And that goes back to those spec sheets, okay? So by having the spec sheet or by looking online or in books, you're gonna find this information, okay? Some things don't tend to change very often, okay? So the chocolate from cacao berry is not likely to change, so we can trust this information for a long time. But heavy cream, for example, if you change from one manufacturer to another, you might see these percentages change. Okay, so if you change the brand of heavy cream that you're working with, you might see a slight change in your ganache recipes because of that. So anytime that we change an ingredient in the kitchen, we need to update the information that we would use for our balancing. So when we do balancing, here's the basic criteria that we really need to find. The basic things are the water percentage, the percentage of sugar, and also the percentage of cocoa butter. So those are the basics. Those are the things that basically everyone needs to know. And then if you're a chocolatier who's specialized highly in ganaches, and that's basically the only thing you make, and let's say you've got 24 types of ganaches in your display case, you're probably going to be looking at more advanced criteria, such as the dry cocoa solids, the dairy fat, liquid oils, proteins, milk solids, non-fat, alcohol, so on and so forth. So if you're new to balancing, start with the basics, and then the more comfortable you become with balancing, the more advanced you can become with that. Some of the criteria in the advanced category is a little harder to find than others. So just keep that in mind. You might have to do a little digging for protein content or something like that. So all of these things we're going to start comparing to each other, and we're going to use this information to evaluate our ganaches, compare them to one another, and also apply them to any future balancing exercises that we might do. So here, this is the ideal, okay, and I say ideal, but even that's subjective, but based on thousands of recipes of ganache made over countless years, lots of trial, study, and evaluation of recipes, we've learned that these are the basic parameters that we want our ganaches, our framed ganaches in this case, to try and fall into. So you can see that on the screen. We want a water content of about 20% maximum, 25 to 30% minimum of sugar content. Cocoa butter content is going to vary greatly. That can depend on the exact format of what you're doing. For a framed ganache, we usually want about 21 to 22% of cocoa butter for a dark chocolate ganache. And then the rest, dairy fat, 15% max, somewhere between 25 to 40% total fat, and 10 to 16% of dry cocoa content. These are the averages, okay? Keep that in mind. This table is not chiseled in stone, okay? You have the ability to define your own ideal parameters. But if you look at more and more ganaches, you're going to see more and more of them that fall into this range, okay? But like I said, it's really not set in stone. I've seen ganaches that are not balanced according to this table, and they're still successful. So there are always exceptions to the rule. But if you start with this, it's going to be a very good starting point, and you're going to be highly likely to have a very successful ganache in the end. Also keep in mind, we're really talking about framed ganaches here. These are the ones that we cut with the guitar and then enrobe. So I'm only talking about the framed ganache today as the example, but these would be different for, say, a ganache that goes into a mold, or a ganache that we pipe, say, for truffles. If you're making cognac truffles or something, the balance of that recipe will be different than the ones for the framed ganaches. Going back to what I said earlier, there's no one ganache recipe for everything. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. This is only for the framed dark chocolate ganache. So the steps that we're going to take to evaluate the criteria are as follows. We're going to find the total percentage of water, then we'll find the total percentage of sugar, we'll find the total percentage of cocoa butter, and finally we'll find the total percentage of dairy fat. So let's look at an example of a framed dark chocolate ganache. So here we have 500 grams of cream, 50 grams of glucose, 650 grams of dark chocolate, and 100 grams of fresh butter. So the first thing that I'm going to do is figure out how much water is in each of those ingredients. So for cream, I'm going to go to my spec sheet. I'm going to figure out how much water is in it. The spec sheet told me that there's 58% of water in my cream. I'm going to multiply that by the amount of cream that I have, and I'm going to figure out the total percentage of water that the cream added into the recipe. And then I'm going to repeat this math for every single ingredient that we have. So I find the amount of water in my glucose syrup, just like I showed you earlier from the spec sheet. We do the math, and we find out that it's bringing 0.8% water into the recipe. There's no water in chocolate, and then from the spec sheet, there was about 18% of water coming from the butter, and that ends up with 1.4% of water coming from butter. You add all of those up, and we find out that the total water content for this recipe is 24.5%. We're going to do the same thing now for sugars. We're going to go through the ingredients one by one. We're going to consult the information that we have on the ingredients, and we're going to do the math. So there's no sugar in cream. The spec sheet told us that the glucose syrup is 78% sugar, so we do the math. We do the math for the dark chocolate, and then we do the math for the butter. We add all of those resulting percentages together to find out that the total sugar content of this recipe is 18%. Okay, then we're going to do the same thing for the cocoa butter content. So this is the easiest one really to find because cocoa butter is only coming from the chocolate. So we really only have to look at the spec sheet for the chocolate and find out that it has 20% cocoa butter in the chocolate that we're using. We do the math to find our total cocoa butter content is 20% in this ganache. And then we'll do the same thing for dairy fat. We do all of our math, and we found out that coming from all of the ingredients, we have about 20% dairy fat content in this ganache recipe. Okay. So here's all of our totals looking at our recipe. So we have a ganache that has 24.5% water, 18% sugar, 20% cocoa butter, 20% dairy fat, and 40% total fat. So what do we do now? Okay. We're going to compare that to the chart that I showed you earlier, which is the ideal percentages for a framed ganache. Okay. So if we look at our recipe, we have 24.5% water, whereas the ideal percentage is 20% maximum. We do the same thing for sugar. So our recipe has 18% sugar versus an ideal ganache would have about 30% minimum of sugar. Cocoa butter, okay, so we have 20% cocoa butter, and we need somewhere between 10 and 26, so no problem there. Total dairy fat, we have 20%. We're looking more for only 15. And then total fat, we're right at the maximum. So what can we conclude about this recipe? Okay. Based on what we found, the cocoa butter content should be ideal. Okay, we should have no problem there. It should be the perfect amount to make the ganache sliceable and not too firm. As for the taste, it has a very low sugar content, so it's very likely that this recipe is going to be quite bitter. Secondly, it's going to exhibit a very buttery taste because we have a very high percentage of dairy fat in the recipe, about 5% more than we would like. And then our shelf life is going to be very likely to be very short, okay, due to the high water content and the low sugar content. So going back to what I said earlier, the higher the water content, the shorter the shelf life. And then the higher the sugar content, the longer the shelf life. So it's quite obvious in this recipe that we need to reduce the amount of water and increase the amount of sugar in order to have a more desirable result out of this ganache. Okay, so a better formulation example would look something like this. Okay, this is the recipe we actually talked about in the very beginning of the presentation. So you can see here, I skipped all of the math, but you see the results at the bottom. Okay, so coming from this recipe, we have 19.8% of water, 29% or basically 30% of sugar, 21% of cocoa butter, 14% of dairy fat, and about 35% total fat. So when we compare this recipe to our ideal percentages, you can see that we're much more in line with what we would expect from a dark chocolate framed ganache. So everything falls in line, which means that cocoa butter content is still good. It should be nice and sliceable. As for the taste, it's going to be a little bit sweeter, which is going to be good in counterbalancing the bitterness of the dark chocolate. We'll have a slight buttery dairy taste, but it won't be overwhelming. And our shelf life should be better because now we have less water and we have more sugar in the recipe. Okay. But again, this recipe, maybe when you make it, it's still not perfect. Maybe you need it to last a little bit longer. Okay, so if you need it to last longer, then we have to increase the solids, increase the sugar, decrease the water. Okay, so then we would need to do more balancing to try and achieve that goal. As we do that, we might find that we lose some of the chocolate flavor or it becomes too bitter or something. So then we are back to the drawing board. And this is what balancing can do, is help us show these potential mistakes before we go and make the recipe in the kitchen and potentially waste our time and also waste our precious ingredients. Okay, so here's the two examples side by side. Okay, the first recipe that I talked about and then also the second recipe that I talked about. You can see the composition of the two. But you can also see that in order to have a better balance, we we ended up having to use different amounts of ingredients, and we also used some different ingredients as well. Okay, you can see that the total amount of heavy cream went down. Okay, and that is so that we reduced the water content. And then we increased the sugar content by using not only more glucose syrup, but we also used invert sugar as well. So we're greatly increasing the total sugar content. We added a little bit of salt, that was just for flavor. And then we added clarified butter. Okay, and we did that to keep the balance of dairy fat where it needs to be, because we, as I said, we reduced the amount of heavy cream. So when we reduce the cream, we're also reducing the dairy fat content, and when we reduced the cream, we reduced the dairy fat content too much. So in order to bring the dairy fat back up a little bit, I added some clarified butter to the recipe. And then lastly, because of all these other changes, we also had to change the amount of chocolate in the recipe went up, so that we keep the cocoa butter content correct. And we even had to add a little bit of added cocoa butter, about 1.6% of added cocoa butter, to keep the balance right where we wanted it. So with all of those changes, is the second recipe the same as the first recipe? Absolutely not. Okay, they're obviously, even on paper, they're not the same recipe. The second recipe, I have an easier time with it in the kitchen. I can slice it, I can dip it, I can do everything that I need. It's going to last longer, but it doesn't taste exactly the same way. The first recipe is much softer, much creamier, and has a different taste. So in this case, I was happy with the taste of the second recipe, so I didn't feel the need to continue changing it. However, had I found that the second recipe just did not taste enough like chocolate, for example, then I would continue balancing it. I would say, okay, I have to have the good chocolate flavor, so I focus on having the chocolate flavor first, and then I balance all of the other ingredients around that. Okay, so really there's no right or wrong here. It's up to you to make those decisions as you see fit. What works for your ganache, what works for your kitchen, what works for your customers. So that's just a very basic example of how we can easily and fairly quickly look at our ganache recipe to understand what's going to happen when we make it. I'll talk just a minute about the process for improving an existing recipe, because this is a very common question that I get. And I always tell people, consider the following parameters. Ask yourself, what needs to be improved? What is it that's wrong? And then based on the answer that you have is going to tell you what needs to change in the balancing. So if it's taste, like I was saying earlier, we're going to look probably at the chocolate, or maybe it's that it doesn't taste enough like raspberry, if it's a raspberry ganache, because you reduced the raspberry puree to reduce the water content. So we're going to have to look at it that way. Or if it's texture, is it too soft? Is it too firm? Maybe it's the process that's difficult. Maybe you have a hard time to make this ganache. Or maybe you have a hard time working with it. You have a hard time piping it into the molds, or you have a hard time cutting it, so on and so forth. So whenever you improve a recipe, you need to know what it is that needs to be improved. So that's the first question. So once you know what needs to be improved, then you can look at it like this. And like I said, taste, that's purely subjective. So if you're making a cinnamon ganache and it doesn't taste enough like cinnamon, well, that's pretty simple. We just need to increase the amount of cinnamon or the length of infusion. But we can't really change, balancing for taste purposes, but we can for the others, for process and texture and workability and so on and so forth. So just a few takeaways here for how to improve an existing recipe when it comes to those, such as texture. Obviously, we need to play with the ratio of ingredients, cocoa butter versus sugar, or look at the types of sugar that we're using, or look at the types of fat that we're using. If it's for shelf life reasons, typically, if we need it to last longer, we're going to have to increase the dry matter, or we're going to have to increase the sugar content. And when it comes to shelf life, a robust knowledge of ingredients is really going to be crucial. You have to understand what they do to increase the shelf life? How good are they at increasing the shelf life? So on and so forth. So a little bit of that comes out of the talk that I gave last week on sugar, and some of that will come next week. I'm going to talk about a basic introduction to shelf life and how I think about shelf life and the things that I take into account for shelf life. So just keep that in mind. The longer you need the shelf life to be, the more you need to understand all of these principles. You need to understand the ingredient interactions and also the characteristics of each of those ingredients. And so what if you want to create a brand new recipe? Let's say that you have something you've never made before, and you want to try and create your own recipe. It's the same process. Ask yourself some questions. Which ingredients will I definitely be using? Okay, so if you want to make a banana ganache that you've never made before, you're definitely going to be using bananas. Step one. So we know banana is an ingredient. And then we base everything else around that. Then we find a chocolate that tastes good with bananas, and then we fill in the other things. How much sugar is in the chocolate? How much sugar is in the banana? So then how much sugar do we need to add in addition to those? So on and so forth. Another thing that you might ask yourself is, do I have a recipe close to the one I want to create? So if you have, for example, a raspberry ganache, maybe you start with that. You just remove the raspberries and you switch it for bananas. But before you go waste your bananas in the kitchen, balance the recipe, see if the sugar content, if the water content changes drastically. That's 9 times out of 10. That's how I start when I make a recipe. I start with a recipe that's close to the one that I want to create. I don't just sit down to a blank sheet of paper and start thinking about it. I typically adapt an existing recipe. And then it starts with experimentation. I'm going to try 2 or 3 recipes. I'm going to make small little test batches of maybe 300 or 400 grams, the smallest amount that I can make. And I'm going to evaluate those. And then I'll pick one that's the closest to what I think is going to be success. And then I continue working on that. Okay, I'm going to optimize the one that I chose, and I'm going to see if my optimizations are leading me in the right direction. Hopefully they do. And then you just need 1 or 2 little tests to really fine tune it and optimize it. There are times when you might have to go back to the drawing board and your intuition was just wrong and the recipe did not go where you wanted it to, and you're back to square one, which is maybe choose another one of the first trials and try and optimize that one. But the idea is to narrow it down, starting from your trials until you end up at the result that you're after that makes you happy. So that's a little bit about creating a recipe from scratch. Okay, so I thought I would give you guys a few resources that you might like to use moving forward. Okay, if you're really into Ganache balancing, aside from the nutrient database that I shared with you earlier, here's a couple of books and things like that I would definitely recommend. Okay. So the first one is Ratio. This is by Michael Ruhlman. Okay, so this book has nothing to do really about chocolate, but it teaches you a lot about ratios of ingredients. I like that one a lot, and it really unlocks the keys to some beneficial ratios and really how to think about ratios and how to apply them, not only to Ganache but to everything that you make. So that's the way I work for everything. It's not only Ganache that I balance. You can balance a cake batter or a bread dough or anything that we make, you can balance. Okay, some other good resources. This edition of So Good Magazine, number 21. Okay, inside is this excellent article from Ramon Morato, who is looking at chocolate ganache. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of pages here talking all about ganache in depth, touching on a lot of the things that I've been talking about. Okay, so that's excellent article, excellent reading there. I definitely recommend that. Another thing is the next edition of So Good Magazine, number 22. Because where Ramon left off in number 21, he picks up in 22, okay, and continues on with his research. So those two editions, I cannot recommend enough. Next, How Baking Works. Okay, so this book has nothing to do about Ganache, okay, but it has excellent resources about sugars, about all emulsifiers, fats, oils. It's a very scientific book about lots of things that we use in the kitchen. Okay, so if you need to know information about ingredients, this book is excellent. And then the last three are all by the same author. This book from Jean-Pierre Weibel, Fine Chocolates, and then Fine Chocolates 2 and Fine Chocolates 3. You're going to find tons of good information in those books. He touches on everything from ingredients to balancing to shelf life, and I've learned a tremendous amount from all of those books. So some resources that I hope help you out. Okay, so let's just finish up right fast. Okay, Q&A. So I'm gonna look through some of the questions that you guys ask, and we'll take a second to answer these. So what is the benefit of using tempered chocolate in our ganache? I never do it. You can. I don't think there's much benefit in starting with tempered chocolate. In my experience, it just makes you work really fast. If you need the ganaches, if you have no other way of crystallizing the cocoa butter inside, you can start with tempered chocolate, but I never do because the ganache sets too fast. It's hard to get into the frames. So I typically choose other methods for that. I would say that's the only benefit, is if you have no other way to crystallize the ganache. All right, next question is, if the water activity is 0.6, what is the shelf life? So I'm going to talk about this next week, okay? I don't have time to get into that this week. It's a big topic. We're going to talk about that next week. So please join me same time next Friday. I'm going to go into shelf life and water activity and what those things are. Can I use a machine to calculate water activity in the ganache? Again, next week we're going to talk about that. So water, ganache, or dairy free doesn't change anything. Okay, the only thing that it might change is when you're doing your balancing, we're just going to remove the dairy fat percentage, but everything else basically needs to stay the same. You still need the same amount of water, the same amount of sugar, the same amount of cocoa butter, so on and so forth. So you don't have to use cream to make your ganaches. We just need the final balance to be correct. Like I said, the correct amount of water, correct amount of sugar, correct amount of fat, regardless of where they come from. Water can come from anywhere. Fat can come from anywhere. It's just those balance percentages that I showed you that matter. It's not the ingredients. So you can easily just use water instead of cream or milk. You could use anything. That's how we make some fruit ganaches, for example. Raspberry ganache might not have heavy cream in it. It's got raspberry puree instead. Am I using any types of tools or software to balance my ganaches, or any recommendations? I don't. I find that software, if you have it, it's super fast. But I don't need more than what I just showed you on screen, and I can do that on paper myself. But as far as good resources, you may know Ganache Solution from Alexander Bordeaux is a great resource. You also have Pro Chalk, which is another one, and H Chalk, I believe, which is from Frederick Hotwecker, is another one. They all do the balancing. You could also set this up in a spreadsheet if you want. But like I said, unless you're really making, if your only job is ganaches all day, every day, then you might invest in software. But if you make a wide variety of products in your shop, you're probably going to have like 4 or 5 or 6 ganache recipes that are already good, and I'm just going to adapt those. Unless, like I said, you have really, really huge volumes and extensive product lines and things of that nature. What is the better way to make a ganache? Melt the chocolate and cream at the same time. This is really up to you. One is not necessarily better than the other. We can find pros and cons to both. When we melt the chocolate and make the ganache that way, all of the fat in the chocolate is melted, so it's a little easier to emulsify the ganache together. But it takes more time in the kitchen. We have to melt that chocolate. So if you're making, I don't know, 10 kilos of ganache, might not be practical to melt it all first. So it's more about process than it is about better. And that just depends. What does better mean? Better in terms of process, better in terms of emulsion, better in terms of shelf life. In terms of shelf life, not so drastic. The choice is, it's really dependent upon several factors. I'm just going through a few more questions. So if I make champagne ganache with white chocolate, can I boil the champagne to reduce the water content? You can. That's not a bad idea. You might change the flavor though of the champagne as you heat it up. So be aware of that as well. But it is possible to do that, absolutely. But the result, it's up to you whether you like it or not, and you would have to do some small tests and see how the flavor is after you do that, and maybe it becomes too bitter over a long period of time because of the reduction. These are things that I haven't tried personally, so I can't tell you with certainty that they work, but it's not impossible to do. So all of the questions about long life of Ganache and finding the water activity, I'm going to talk about that next week because it's a big subject, and we just don't have time for that today. So how can you improve the taste of Ganache using berries without altering the water content? Well, the best way that you can really do this, in my opinion, okay, so there are obviously other solutions, but you need to concentrate that in some fashion, okay? So if you want to increase the amount of berries that you're using in the recipe, typically we need to use a lot of fruit to really have that true fruit flavor. So the more you increase the amount of berries, you have to remove water from somewhere else. But you could also do this through concentration. So if you take fruit puree and you reduce it, you boil it down, you remove some of the water out of the fruit puree, you're concentrating the flavor of the fruit puree. That works for some fruits, like passion fruit, it works great. Pineapple, it works well. The fruits that have a lot of water in them, that tends to work very well. Versus fruits that don't have a high water content, it can be difficult to reduce them without changing the flavor of the fruit. So you could also do things like add freeze-dried fruit powder into your recipe. So if you're making a raspberry ganache and you want to fortify the flavor even more, you could add freeze-dried raspberry powder into it, which would be a solution which would bring a lot of raspberry flavor from the powder. Something like that. There's a couple of options there. Someone asked about the book Ganache by Jean-Michel Pierre. It's another great book. I just don't have access to it. It's actually at the office on my desk. We'll talk a little bit about how to use alcohol in Ganache next week as well. Do other vegetable fats work as a replacement for dairy fat? Yes and no. This goes back to understanding your ingredients. Fats are very complex and they don't all get along with one another. So you have to be careful about which fats you're using in your recipe. I don't have time to get in-depth conversation about fats, but you definitely can. The big takeaway here, there are no rules. If you want to use water, use water. If you want to use coconut, use coconut. If you want to use whatever else, you can. You just have to be aware of what those ingredients do. That's the big takeaway, is understanding those ingredients. So yes, it's certainly possible. If you look through some books and some different materials, you will definitely find vegan ganaches that are using soy and all sorts of things like that. So people are definitely doing that. It is highly, highly possible. A lot of questions about alcohol, so I'll just talk about alcohol for just a second. Alcohol, typically 5%, maybe depending on the recipe and depending on the type of alcohol that you're using. We typically don't see more than 5 to 10% max of alcohol in a recipe. It just depends on, like I said, the alcohol that you choose to work with, because it depends on how strongly they taste and also their alcohol content. You have to realize that I'm going to use a very basic example. If you have a whiskey that's 50% alcohol, the other 50% is water. Okay, so you have to take this into account for the balancing as well. Or if you're using an alcohol that's only 20% alcohol, then you might have 60% of water and 20% of sugar. So you need to keep that in mind when working with the alcohols. But typically we don't see above about 5 or 10%, and that's because of taste and also because of cost. Alcohol is very expensive, so if you get much above that, you're making a very expensive recipe. Okay. Okay, so that I hope answers a few of your questions. And so last but not least, I just wanted to say thank you. And make sure that you tune in next Friday, where, like I said, I'm going to talk about an introduction to shelf life. If you want to go back and look at the sugar article, make sure that you sign up for our newsletter. We will send you the PDF on that, and you can also watch it on Chocolate Academy Online right now. You can go to our Instagram TV page, and you can watch last week's talk about sugars. We're going to put the video here that we just discussed on Ganache. That'll be on Instagram TV as well. So make sure and check those out. Okay. So with that, I wish you guys a happy Friday. Happy Easter weekend. Take care of yourselves. Try and make the most of quarantine, and I will see you guys next Friday. Have a great weekend.